Well, hello there, everyone. Welcome to the 130th edition of DF Direct Weekly, which is still somehow our weekly discussion show discussing the latest gaming and technology news. It's been a massive week, obviously, with the Microsoft FTC leak. If you've not seen our DF Direct special on that, go check that out. We're going to be mostly avoiding that for this one. Joining me, first of all, to discuss all of the remaining news, we have Alex Battaglia. Hello.
Hey there, yes, a discussion show where we discuss things. Very, very great description there, Rich, of what DF Direct is.
Yeah, it's the incisive analysis that Digital Foundry is known for.
We're known for that.
And Oliver McKenzie, hi.
Hey, Rich, fun to be here. Should be a fun chat today. Or tonight, in my case.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the first news topic. Okay, so today, when this direct goes public, it's going to be the embargo for Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. Our video will be following shortly. We should already have our PC-focused video based on 2.0 content and specifically DLSS 3.5 out there. And Oliver, I'm going to go to you first on this in terms of the console side of things. When Tom basically did the preview content back in the day, it looks like, obviously it was looking like a fantastic game. Performance profile seemed to be pretty much unchanged. I mean, is there anything to add to that?
Well, what I would basically say is that I'm not super happy with Cyberpunk performance as of patch 1.63 on consoles. And I'm not super happy with Cyberpunk performance as of patch 2.0. In the performance mode in particular, the game has quite a lot of frame rate drops out in the open world on PS5 and Series S and Series X, all in their respective 60 FPS modes. And that basically has not changed for Phantom Liberty. If anything, it might actually be a little bit worse in my testing. But in terms of the graphics, I think the game still looks good in perfectly rasterized form or in local shadow RT form on the consoles. The only caveat there, obviously, well, the big caveat is that it isn't using the same ray tracing features as PC, so it's not on that level, obviously. The art assets and the density of the world is very impressive. It's certainly comparable with some of the denser areas in Cyberpunk. There are lots of civilians everywhere. There's some really beautiful art design, like the team did a great job on that. It's a really good experience overall. It's just those frame rate drops that irritate me a little bit, but overall, it's quite a good experience.
Doesn't VRR save the day?
Yes, VRR on a compatible display mostly improves it. There's a little bit of an issue. I think it might be related to CPU performance a little bit on the consoles, but it is substantially better with VRR.
Okay, interesting. Let's talk about PC, Alex, because here's the thing, right? I mean, in the Microsoft leak. Direct special, it wasn't weekly. We talked about basically next generation consoles and the kind of reticence I guess we had about what was on offer there was basically that it's not as feature rich as what's happening in the PC space like 5 years earlier, i.e. now. And DLSS 3.5 does appear to be the next evolution of visuals, and it's phenomenal, right?
Yeah, it's very, very good. So obviously my video is going to, and it's going to be out by this time this comes out, so I can just talk about it a bit. But there's going to be obviously it's going to be a lot of positives there, because I actually think on like an 80% level, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not saying 80% of all my recordings look better or something like that. But like personally, I would say it's like 80% there of being like a vastly better image. And then there's some issues that come out that actually remind me a little bit of DLSS 2.0's early versions. Issues that it had. So, for example, I see in a couple of areas, like we saw with earlier versions of DLSS, a bit of posterization or you might call it over sharpening on certain edges that occur, and that showed it off in my video. And I also see on some areas, depending upon the size of the object and the amount of ambient lighting, so I think like small people like in the distance, cars in the distance, and also like small objects like bits of trash rolling on the ground or trash fluttering through the air, they actually have like some intense ghosting behind them at times. Sometimes it's not always though, like in direct sunlight it won't occur, but it will happen in like indirect lighting situations. And I point that all out in my video. And they remind me a lot of the issues that DLSS 2.0 base had that were cleaned up kind of over a number of year period, where we now look at DLSS, like the latest versions of DLSS where like these things are just not an issue anymore. So it's really, really interesting to see how it'll evolve over time. And I think it is a bit of a DLSS 2.0 moment as a result of that. Like, if you really do put them side by side, in like most of the cases, it's a lot better. And the thing is, you're getting a game that's also running better while looking better most of the time. That's a rare deal. That's a really rare deal. I think that's the one thing, like, a lot of people are just going to be like looking at like the areas where it fails, but they're not like realizing, wait, it's actually running better while looking better most of the time, which is kind of like what DLSS is all about. So, you know, it's like, it is obviously always a trade-off because you're not doing native rendering and you're relying on, you know, something that needs iteration time because it's an ML model that is its first iteration of it that we're seeing in a game. So I'm super excited for the future there because I think it's going to have a similar evolution period to the original DLSS. Regarding what Oliver said about the game, I think now after trying it on the Ryzen 5 3600 again, I did measure that it was a little bit heavier on the CPU doing our little cool benchmark run there. And I think that is interesting that we have such a clear, I think it is one of those clearly CPU limited titles on console. We don't have a lot of really good examples of it always because it's hard to get a sense of those kind of things. But I think with the fact that they use dynamic resolution on consoles, and it's going to be scaling, you know, whether, you know, based upon Tom's, for example, original preview footage, he like noticed the scaling pretty intensely there in the moments when it was GPU limited. But here, definitely when I was on that Ryzen 5 3600, I'll show in the footage in the video, you can definitely see it's like going up and down like a roller coaster, depending upon where you are in the town. So that's pretty cool to see. And I think it's going to lead to fun stuff behind the scenes when Rich ever finds the time to use his Frankenstein's monster of a PC there to get some really cool benches of Cyberpunk and other games that we have now the settings for. Yeah,
absolutely. That is really interesting, right? I think the other thing, of course, is the concept of actually being able to use those developer streaming developer streaming saves to actually use the cross-save thing to bring those over to the consoles to see if they work.
That'd be cool.
I'm kind of intrigued to give that a go because that could be quite fun. I mean, the city one that we use is pretty much the only usable one, I think. There's another one which goes into the city. The other thing, of course, is that doesn't quite enter the Tom's Diner area where CPU really seems to get absolutely hammered. But yes, I'm actually really interested to find actual scenarios on consoles where we're definitely CPU limited, where beyond a shadow of a doubt it's the CPU that's the bottleneck, and then to compare it to actually running the PC code on the Xbox CPU via the 4800S desktop kit. That's all just really, really sort of kind of just weird testing I'd like to do for some reason. I've actually got a supporter question for you here, Alex. Nice. It's from Michael Pern. Hi crew, recently I played Cyberpunk 2077 version 2.0, hoping to see if DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction would allow for better ray traced effects, e.g. reflection quality, without requiring the full path tracing option enabled. Sadly, this is not the case in the Cyberpunk options menu. I thought ray reconstruction could be brought to the table for all RTX features without full path tracing. Otherwise, this feature on RTX 2 and 3 cards seems pointless due to extremely heavy requirement of path tracing. I think that he's got a point there, right? Because surely in your roundtable, they were actually saying ray reconstruction could be really good on just standard RT effects, but it wasn't deployed in Cyberpunk.
Yeah, I think this is actually just a timing issue, something that Jakob also pointed out, because you know, when you have a set release date, and for this game they want to position it in between something like Starfield, they want to position it between the, you know, October Madness. There's also things where ray reconstruction doesn't support DLAA right now. So if you did want to play the game with, for example, at like 1080p or 1440p DLAA with a RTX 4000 series card, which I think is a viable way to play the game, you can't even use ray reconstruction there right now. I think it's just kind of still not fully done in terms of how they want it perfectly integrated at the end of the day. It doesn't support DLAA. It doesn't support the other RT modes. I think that's just like a little bit of engineering and QA time that they didn't have before the game launch. And as far as I know, DLAA is planned support, as well as there's planned support to enable it with any of the ray tracing options. Now, the one thing I wouldn't necessarily say is right now with path tracing, if you turn on RT Overdrive, it will run better with ray reconstruction on, as my video will show. I don't necessarily think that might be the case with if you turn it on, if you just have like reflections on, or just have RT lighting on, or just RT shadows on, because I imagine those individual denoisers for those things are perhaps a bit simpler, and they're not as heavy. Brian pointed out a 2 millisecond cost for the ray tracing at 4K on an RTX 4090. So if you go down the stack, it's like, then it goes up to like 4 milliseconds on something like a 3080, 3090. And then it goes, if you're running a 2070 or something like that, it goes up to like 8 milliseconds if you think about it.
You wouldn't be doing 4K
if you wouldn't be doing 4K there, but if you're doing like 1440p, maybe it's like something like 5 to 6 milliseconds just for the denoising for ray reconstruction or something like that. That is definitely a difference. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind whenever they up, because this is obviously they're still not done with the game. They even hinted in the interview, they're like, oh, maybe we'll try and add some more ray tracing goodness. Jakob mentioned at one moment. So it's still not done. Cyberpunk is just never done. Dauerbaustelle, I would say in German.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I don't really know if we've got too much more to add because we've got so much content either on the channel now or in the pipeline. So, I guess we'll leave it there for now and just wait and see how our final analysis all shapes up. Let's move on to the next topic. So this one is actually Cyberpunk adjacent because it was actually quite interesting to see the reaction from the press to what DLSS 3.5 is doing. And there was a general acceptance with the asterisks and the caveats that, hey, this is actually really impressive technology. And it's something that's only exclusive to NVIDIA. So in the RX 7800 XT review, I sort of had a bit, well, I wouldn't say it's a bit of a rant, it's more of an open question to the audience, to other reviewers possibly, which is simply this: if you've got one vendor that has superior features to another vendor, to the point where with Cyberpunk, and I guess with the upcoming Alan Wake, you're getting an absolutely transformed game. How do we factor that into our reviews? And more generally, we're moving into a situation now where upscaling is actually factored into engine design. Unreal Engine 5, right? I mean, go back to the Matrix Awakens. There's actually a part in that demo where it's just a showcase of all of the different technologies and how they merge together to produce that phenomenal effect. And basically, Unreal Engine 5 was built with upscaling in mind, right? How do you actually factor that into a GPU review where the entire basis of everybody's GPU reviews, ours included, is that we're judging all of these products based on the fact that they can actually deliver the same thing, the same workload, just with performance differentials. But that's not the case anymore. Especially with DLSS, which I do think has been a game-changing technology, possibly more so than RT. At this point, it's just something that people want. We saw obviously with the mods for Starfield, 960,000 DLSS mod downloads, 960,000. It's clearly a technology that people with RTX cards want. How do we factor this into reviews? And I'm actually open to a full discussion across the board, and I actually put this to supporters, right? Yeah. And we got some interesting responses here. And I guess this one is actually interesting. This one from Retro Sean. Hi DF, exclamation marks. When it comes to GPU benchmarks, the problem is NVIDIA's marketing team want to pretend that frame generation is the same as a higher base frame rate when we know it is not. I think you could design a review where you could include both performance data and then a section on performance stacking up the best of what upscaling has to offer between competing products. It will be a lot of extra work. Absolutely. This one from Struggling Shader. Hi, Rich and crew, exclamation point. About GPU reviews and even upscaling settings recommendations, why not use output perceived quality to compare performance? For instance, since FSR is usually the worst looking for the same input resolution, you can take that as a base for recommending presets and matching overall image quality, the closest preset for DLSS on NVIDIA. could be the same. It might be 1 or 2 presets lower depending on the game. Am I wrong? I know it's a little bit subjective and a little bit of extra work, but you guys have the most credible eyes in the industry, and the benchmark suite doesn't change that often. Keep up the great work! ! This one from Mitten-Faced Lass. Hey Rich, in regards to apples GPU comparisons, I personally definitely think they're a bit outdated / not that useful anymore. Comparing native 4K performance in a title when it features both DLSS and FSR, or only one or the other, etc., isn't realistic. People are going to use the technologies that give them better and smoother experiences. Sometimes that means the competitor doesn't really have an answer, and that's fine. It's the reality of the market. If anything, I think emphasizing that in reviews will push competitors to respond and improve those areas they're lacking in. And for the average user, it will provide an accurate view of how the hardware will serve them. Apples to apples is intellectually interesting, but at the end of the day, it's not how the hardware is used 90% of the time. Well, that percentage, I think, is possibly arbitrary, but I think the sentiment is bang on.
Yeah.
Oliver, thoughts on this?
I think it's very complex. I can see both sides of it myself. I think there's probably it would be really nice to have something like an objective benchmark where we could say, ISO image quality keeping the same across vendors. How does one card perform relative to another? I think the problem with that is that the artifacts that are created by FSR are quite different in character to the artifacts that are created by DLSS when you really push DLSS. I think they're quite different. And also just because the existence of such a tool is a little questionable. There's some interesting stuff from Netflix, I know, on comparing different video and comparing different compression models, but I'm not totally sure that it's applicable for us. Obviously, you guys could speak a little bit more to that because I think if they can look at that. I think on the other end of the spectrum, you could just go completely subjective and say, well, this card is really good. For instance, if you're just reviewing a card in general, like this card might be really good for ray tracing at this resolution, or this card might be giving you a good experience in games with full path tracing at this resolution because of ray reconstruction potentially on the NVIDIA side and general graphics performance. But obviously that isn't going to satisfy people who just want to see bar charts. So I really don't know how you resolve that, at least in the short term, with something that is going to be appropriately objective while still capturing the necessary data and information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I love Mitten-Faced Lass's thing there because I posted about it on Twitter, but Tom's Hardware also in their DLSS 3.5 Cyberpunk review, they literally said this outright. They're like, we don't know what's going to happen with the GPU market right now. NVIDIA's got these huge advantages. And I think the keeping with the old just benchmarks at like settings like 4K Ultra native just doesn't make any sense anymore. It would be like going back to the year 2003 to 2005. Or actually, I'd say like 2002 to 2004, and you're just like looking at DX7 performance at that point in time or something like that. You're not paying attention to DX 8.1, DX9, and you're not kind of like, and the cards are changing. They're offering vastly different experiences if you go up to DX9, but you're just like, I want to play Max Payne. I want to do Quake 3 Arena benchmarks. And this isn't very helpful to the user to understand, how do I get the most interesting new graphical experience in a game with performance and good image quality and all these things? So if you just kept doing DX7 benchmarks like then you'd be out of date. And I feel like that's the way the benches are right now. As to how we do it, I think I talked about this. It had to have been like 2 years ago. And we also saw it a bit in the discussion that I had the roundtable with Brian and Jakob there, where it's like the subjective experience of playing the game is really important. And since we do lack great objective tools at the moment that I think Rich can talk about really quickly about the thing we just tried out, that we need to increase the size of the conclusion of the benchmark video. Yeah. Because that conclusion includes a lot of things like where you say like, okay, I just talked about those graphs, but how are you actually using this in experience? And you say like, maybe the other suggestion here is like, in this game, you'd maybe want to use FSR performance on an AMD GPU, quality mode, 4K quality mode. But on the NVIDIA GPU, you can get away with balanced performance and have maybe even objectively better image quality still in some areas. And you talk about it, you weigh the subjectivity of it at the end of the review, and then you let the user decide. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe the argument is that there is some kind of test for upscaling on specific titles, and then we actually test on the resolutions best suited to that card. That possibly, but yeah, I mean, in terms of the test that we're talking about, I think Oliver just alluded to it, that there's actually a number of image quality comparison models based on AI that are out there now, used by the likes of Netflix to figure out decent image quality. One of them is really interesting because it was trained simply by giving people access to two video streams and comparing them, and then they would say which one they thought was best subjectively. And when that is done, thousands upon thousands of times with different people, inherently, basically the biases emerge, and you get a model that basically gives you the opportunity to assess video quality. And we actually did this on DLSS versus FSR2 in Cyberpunk 2077. And basically it gives you a quality result between 0 and 1. Okay, obviously there's lots of decimal points involved, so you could say like 1 to 10,000 if you like, just by changing the decimal point. In virtually every scenario, DLSS came out better than FSR2. However, the actual number generated wasn't actually that much different. And so we put together we took all of the DLSS versus FSR2 examples from Alex's Starfield video and tested those as well. And again, DLSS was better than FSR2, quantifiably better according to this. But the thing that sort of didn't sit right with me was the fact that stuff, for example, that fiery example for your Starfield comparison, it's pretty blatant that FSR just isn't coping very well. DLSS copes better, but it wasn't reflected in the score that was pumped out. And I honestly think that maybe the model is just looking for compression artifacts. And I think, as opposed to, seeing what is objectively a better or subjectively a better image. And I think it was just the fact that the nature of FSR2 artifacting is a bit noisier, right? And so that was actually coming back from the model as like more pronounced compression artifacting. So the search goes on for some kind of tool to objectively measure image quality, or subjectively via a neural network. Tricky, really, really
tricky stuff.
Yeah. I'm just sort of seeing what this support question here from David Laszlo. Hey DF, I can see the need for the image quality comparison. To be honest, this is one of my gripes about GPU reviews. They just show raw numbers. I think it would be good for users to actually see why upscaling X is better than upscaling Y. You see, that's kind of like a different topic, which Alex does quite well in his adjacent content. Maybe a small section in the GPU review could be to match the GPUs in various titles which support both DLSS, FSR, and XeSS. The goal of the section is to identify where the picture quality really falls apart, just like Alex does in his PC videos. For example, FSR users can enjoy a good, close to native presentation in balance mode, while DLSS could go down to performance mode. This would show the value of the feature on the card. I'd say 5 to 10 minute segment in a handful of titles can be enough to show the user what can be achieved. Yeah, there is merit to that. This is quite interesting because we had a conversation with Tom Peterson with Intel about this last year, right, Alex? And he was coming up with the notion of basically like a canned sequence that is run on all of the upscalers and then compared to what you might call ground truth. And where there are deviations, there would be some kind of, I don't know what it was, a visual highlight or maybe a heat map.
Yeah, it was like the heat maps that we have actually as part of SPS Detect, FPS GUI, Rich. Like the difference between frame stuff.
It could.
Yeah, but so this is something Brian alluded to in Brian Catanzaro when we were talking to him, but talking about the training process for DLSS 3.5. They are using Omniverse and Unreal Engine, most likely 5. I didn't actually say which version. I'm pretty sure it's 5 because of the path tracing there. But they're probably using something like Matinee or whatever they call it these days. I forget. It's the frame, like the ability to track view the camera along a way and have the settings be perfect. But that's a lot of setup time. We could do it though. John's done these things before for videos. It would not be that hard to have him make a sequence, and then you could just run on different computers. But there's the issue that not everything is deterministic in video game rendering. So you'd have to really make sure it is a ridiculously deterministic, like it's literally the exact same every single time. And I don't know how possible that is. And then, what are you achieving with this scenario? It would have to be it would have to show off all the different things. Like you've got third-person games, you've got first-person games, you've got camera whip pans, and all these things that a user can do with a mouse and or controller. The mouse is so differentiating on PC. It is, like I talked about before with checkerboard rendering. I was like, yeah, that maybe works really well on a controller where you're soft panning, but on a mouse, you're just like, zoop, and you're all of a sudden like at a completely different area. And it's like, what happens now? And this is one of the test cases that you don't get on console. And you'd have to somehow maybe reflect that there. It's a lot. I like the idea a lot, but there's the danger there of that becoming like the test bed and the thing that we use as an objective measuring, but it's maybe not really representative, and if it's maybe overemphasizing certain aspects by accident. Because you don't have the huge suite. Like I haven't done one of them in a while, but the image quality videos that I did, like there was those 10. I don't know how many points there were. There were too many points. It was so hard to make those videos, people, and you can't definitely do that for each and every GPU review. It would take so much time. Yeah. Those things took like a week and a half by themselves, maybe even 2 weeks almost. So this is a hard one. I would love to have the ability to hand this work off to an AI that says, oh, I know what ghosting is. Oh, I know what fizzle is. I know what aliasing is.
Yeah.
I would like that.
Any further thoughts, Oliver?
Well, I think also one further problem that could potentially pop up is the fact that I think DLSS implementations and XeSS implementations, maybe just by their AI nature and their generalizable nature, are actually relatively similar between games. But with FSR2, there are some really nasty ones, like Remnant 2, its FSR2 implementation, at least at launch, looked like really bad. It had all kinds of artifacting everywhere. It might have been using the earlier 2.0 version. I'm not totally sure. It looked quite bad, and that was very apparent even just using the PC version for a few minutes to test image quality against consoles. So it's a little bit hard to say, okay, here's a generalizable case for FSR versus XeSS versus DLSS, because the FSR implementation, or I mean, to be fair, the other implementations of other upsamplers could be bad in that particular title, right?
You're right.
This question from Nico Simmons. No question per se. I just enjoyed the AI visuals roundtable tremendously! ! Thanks. Thank you for providing insights straight from the crucible of the Foundry, my go-to place for this kind of topic. Perhaps. How do you, Richard, and the others from the team perceive the quote-unquote stance of many gamers, also on the PCMR subs, that upscaling and frame gen are not quote-unquote real frames? I feel there is a great potential there for further elaborating. Entirely agree with what has been said on the roundtable myself, but I fear many people will simply not spend the time to watch the longer roundtable video and kind of miss the point. It's not NVIDIA PR. This is intrinsically valuable for all GPU vendors and us gamers, because this is where we are headed, out of necessity even. I know this was discussed often on the Direct, but it might be a nice quote-unquote backtrack or highlight in the coming DF Directs. Have a great rest of the week, you all! Exclamation point. Awesome work, especially the last few months. I feel you really put in the work and it shows. This whole concept of fake frames, and I think the key point from the roundtable from CDPR itself was we fake everything. The whole concept of rendering is that it's faking an effect. Is that an accurate summary of that point? I think it's worth sort of highlighting, Alex.
Yeah, and Oliver can obviously say something about this too, but if you like just try and get anything rendered on the screen, you're making already incredible trade-offs versus what reality is. And it's all, at that point, it's all an approximation. It's all an emulation or a simulation of what it is. It's all trying to cheat to get as much performance as possible. So in that case, and it just goes back through time itself. Like John did a video on water rendering throughout the years for DF Retro. Go back in time on that and look at all the way we all could recognize it in our brain as water from the, from like the NES up until now. We were saying that in our brains because we could identifiably recognize it due to certain characteristics, but they were all just variations and improvements on cheating to get to the point of where we actually have like H2O particles and they're simulated as a giant mass that moves contiguously. It doesn't even make sense to do that. But, like it's all cheats. So this new era of cheats is maybe also like a necessity, as mentioned here by Nico, where the cost to relay the cost, like Moore's Law is dead, saying that isn't just talk, like they're obviously making these processors faster. The 4090 is a ridiculously chunk faster than the 3090. But the thing is, like, how can they get the cost? Isn't Moore's Law also talking about reducing the cost as well, too? Or is it just the doubling the production, the size? I don't remember. But basically, you're not communicating that price difference to the consumer anymore. So that's part of it. And this is a way of extracting more performance in a smarter way, saying silicon doesn't just need to be about doubling the amount of GPU compute we have, but it's using a different style of compute to enhance the presentation. So I intrinsically agree with all that. I think it's amazing. I thought the answer from Jakob and Brian on this point were really amazing. And I always will pose the question of, what do you think looks more realistic? A 480p DVD of The Matrix or The Matrix Awakens demo running on an Xbox Series X? What do you think looks more realistic? I don't know. I would say that 480p DVD or whatever it is. So...
Okay. Well, just to
it's 480i.
Just to clear it up, Moore's Law is the observation that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. There's nothing really about cost there. It's just been the sort of adjacent thing to Moore's Law, which is that the processes have typically allowed for cost reductions as well, and the cost reductions don't seem to be happening anymore based on that Xbox leak, where a 2024 Xbox Series X is slated to cost the same as a 2021.
Same great price.
Same great price.
Adorably all digital.
Adorably all digital.
I think, just to put a cap on the whole GPU thing, I saw a bar chart yesterday for Cyberpunk, and it was basically 4K native path traced, which is an entirely useless bar chart to put together, right? And it starts at the 4090 running at like 34 frames per second. Even if you've got the 4090, you're not going to be using native resolution rendering because it's just a stupid way to deploy the resources of the 4090. Why produce the bar chart in the first place other than to impose an artificial apples to apples metric that will apply to all GPUs, but not the way they're actually going to be used? It's nuts. I don't get it. Just to be clear, benchmarks aren't going to go away, right? Because eventually we'll reach the point where there will probably be feature parity at some point in the future. Who knows when that will actually be? Because, NVIDIA is literally like, I don't know, at least 3 years ahead, I'd say, possibly 5 of the competition, based on, the deployment of these new features and the sort of staggered response from the competition. And you can't really ignore that anymore, I don't think. And the fact is also that DLSS is so pervasive now in different titles to the point where if it doesn't have it, somebody makes a mod to add it. Obviously, it's got to be factored into a GPU review. But yeah, it's kind of like possibly the beginning of the end of the bar chart until we have that parity again. And who knows when that will be, if ever. Let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so extra controversy this week, as it was the release for Mortal Kombat 1, and we finally got to see the Nintendo Switch version of the game. Now, this is an interesting one because the developer targeted the current generation of consoles, right? But Switch was added as well. And the thing about Switch is that it's obviously not as powerful as the last generation of consoles. One might even argue it's like 1.5 to 2 generations behind. So you've got this game basically developed for entirely different hardware, deployed to vintage 2015 NVIDIA mobile technology, and it was pretty disastrous. Oliver, obviously Tom is producing the content for this. He has shared some assets with us, and it is looking
assets. Sorry for the emphasis on it.
The thing is that the reason we're talking about it here is the actual news point is that Ed Boon has said that the Switch's issues will, quote unquote, absolutely be addressed. And my response to that is in block capitals, but how?
I think,
thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I don't understand exactly how this is going to happen. For a bit of a recap on the game itself, the Switch version renders at quite a low resolution. The game runs with quite a low frame rate as well. I think Tom has it as 20 to 60 FPS during gameplay. It has limited lighting detail, no facial animation in cutscenes, all kinds of bugs. It's a nasty situation, and I totally agree with you that the idea of developing a cross-platform title across both current-gen systems and the aged Nintendo Switch is daunting. I can't imagine that's an easy process, but the results just aren't good enough in this case. I would personally like to stake a claim here that I don't think they'll fix the issues in a way that to a level where the game will actually be a good experience on Switch. That's my suspicion. In part because I took a look at a number of games that have actually been improved on Switch for an upcoming video, and even for the games that I identified as being substantially improved on Switch, it's often things that are a little bit more on the minor side, like stable performance or the addition of a post-processing effect or two. It's not usually like a dramatic overhaul in the game's visual presentation and gameplay presentation to players. So I have to say, I think with a game like this, it's simply a better idea to target the game towards consoles that can actually handle it and not 2015 era mobile NVIDIA graphics hardware. That's my opinion.
I mean, the issues will absolutely be addressed, says Ed Boon, and I've got a bullet point list here from Tom of the issues that need to be addressed. 20 to 60 FPS performance in actual fights. This is the thing, right? Mortal Kombat 11 was substantially pared back on Switch, but it kept the frame rate. It was really good.
Yeah.
Basically the cameo stuff just causes big frame rate drops, and that's one of the big sort of additions to the game. Loading times, 40 seconds to get into a fight. On PlayStation 5, 8 seconds. Visual bugs, flickering shadows, hair cloth physics glitches, no jaw animations on the reptile character, missing geometry pop-in. Low resolution, I think that's to be expected. 576p to 756p docked, 396p to 720p portable.
Oh yeah.
And Tom actually shared this nice image, which actually I was quite happy about because it really does suggest that Chad Warden has made his debut in a Mortal Kombat title. I mean, it is just the pose, but Chad in Mortal Kombat's got to happen, surely. That's the way to fix the Switch version. Thoughts on this one, Alex? It's an uphill struggle, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I just like Oliver. I just don't see. I feel like this is slightly. I mean, I feel like this is slightly another realm issue where, like, they didn't have to do this. They didn't have to release the game on Switch, right? And kind of like with their PC ports, like they're not necessarily handled with the same grace as the other console versions. And like here, they just didn't need to port it to Switch. I think since they targeted PS5 and Xbox Series X here, a lot of the base visual content just doesn't run. Hence why they turn off facial animations. Like, you don't just turn off facial animations like normally in a game, right? So obviously, whatever the deformation is on the faces, the amount of bones, etc., it just doesn't scale. If they put it on Switch, it would run at like 0 FPS or something like that. So they turned it off. They literally turned it off. So that was and as soon as you started getting to we turn off entire systems, kind of like turning off the Nemesis system on the PS3 version of whatever the heck that game is called, Shadow of Mordor, like where you start losing the purpose of the game's existence on top of the visual issues, on top of like the performance issues. Then you just start going to, there's no reason to have this port. It's like started getting into that, like, we can run Doom on the Jag. Kind of like it's taking away a lot of the experience to the point where there's not a good one anymore. It's losing the core element of the game. And I think, yeah, like Oliver said, I don't know what they do to save this in a way that we would still want to recommend it. Maybe they could get it objectively running better in certain areas, but it would have to be so monumental that it just seems insurmountable.
Okay. This question from Martin Peters.
Mortal
Kombat 1 Switch ports keeps on getting widely mocked for its visual degradations compared to other versions. PC Gamer is even calling it, quote unquote, terrifyingly hilarious. I think indeed it is mainly the eye shading of the characters that makes it look weird at times, but isn't something else at play here too? A specific game/conversion being widely mocked on social media because it is the popular thing to do. This could also be seen with T-Loop 1 PC conversion, where the exact same videos of the exact same rare glitches were shared over and over again on socials. And actually, some of those glitches weren't even from the PC version.
Yeah.
My real question, aren't people on socials mocking specific games maybe just too much sometimes to attract views just for fun and quote-unquote schadenfreude? This can make some issues that games have seem much larger than they really are, influencing people's opinions heavily, and developers might actually suffer from this. Is this becoming a problem in your eyes? I'm not sure it's a problem because, memes surrounding game bugs have been there for decades.
Yeah.
And obviously it can be cruel. It can be out of context. There's never any nuance, but often there is a kernel of truth there. And in this case, Mortal Kombat 1 on the Switch is sort of veering pretty close to disaster territory, right? So I don't know. The thing is, it's people making fun of crap things is just something that happens, right? Any input on that one?
Well, I mean, I think that in part with this title in particular, there is a very good reason as to why the game is being mocked. Certainly with other titles, it could be a little bit more cherry-picked, and in this case, there are some bugs that are being maybe cherry-picked a little bit. But I have a different standard for what punters on Twitter are saying versus what, for instance, we would say, or another outlet would say, in a more considered and careful review. So I don't really think it's a problem personally.
I'll tell you what is the problem. It's the completely disingenuous comparisons. It's like, oh, here's Gears 4 in 2014 or whatever, and here's the latest game, and the latest game looks a lot worse when they're not comparable in any way whatsoever. That's kind of like
a lot better.
There's definitely a distinction between bad actors who are just trying to make a point, trying to get views / impressions, since now you get paid for it on Twitter /X, and actually just making fun of a game or pointing out issues that are genuine concerns, like Mortal Kombat 1 on Switch. Definitely, there's definitely a PSA angle beneath the amusement. Right?
I agree with that, and I see some comments on fora and on under the YouTube videos that I make about PC versions where I have a heavy focus on stuttering, and it's this very subjective thing for me where I say I literally just don't play games that stutter all the time or stutter semi-frequently, just because my brain turns off when I see it. And I make a big deal about it in the videos because I so desperately want it to be fixed, because I know it doesn't need to be there. Mm-hmm. I know it doesn't need to be there. So it is technically not, I'll make a video that's 40% about that. 40% of your game experience is maybe not objectively stuttering. But for me, I think since I'm trying to put the critical view on it so that it does get fixed, I focus heavily on it. So I see a lot of comments on videos saying Alex is overemphasizing these things. Maybe people are overemphasizing issues, certain specific issues with that Switch port, and there's actually more pressing ones. Or with T-Loop 1, there, technically you could have blazed through that game on launch on a super high-end processor, right? Mm-hmm. But that wasn't what the base experience was, and it wasn't. If we just said that, oh yeah, you can blaze through a game on a super high-end processor, oh, stuttering's not bad, you can just ignore it, then we're not actually making the games better at that point with our critiques. So sometimes overemphasizing issues, if you're not trying to just mock something, it can actually be very productive. So that's another thing to say.
Well, here's the thing, basically, since we've started highlighting the issues with PC games and stuttering, we've actually brought it to prominence.
Yeah.
And often it gets fixed. what if we hadn't done that? I guess the classic example would have been Sackboy Adventure, which was, just pretty it was basically disastrous at launch, and they fixed it. That's basically an example of reacting to a critique positively, right? And it is constructive criticism. This is all about making games better. And let's make something clear here. A lot of the stuff which you point out for stuttering is actually something that is not how the game should not be running like this. And more to the point, usually it doesn't run like that on the consoles.
Yeah.
Why should the PC user be disadvantaged? I'm still sort of a bit annoyed that, often the case. I mean, we go into a AAA release on the PC kind of girding our loins and expecting the worst because we've been disappointed so many times. There can be no argument that the state of PC gaming on AAA in particular is in a particularly perilous state at the moment. And somebody needs to step up to say this isn't good enough. Yeah. And, it just wrangles me again. Go back to those sort of GPU reviews with those bar charts, 4090 running at like 200 frames per second. Doesn't matter if you suddenly have a frame time spike, which is like half a second. It just doesn't, the experience is completely ruined if that is happening. That is not the way it should be functioning. Mm-hmm. And, that's part of the technical critique. And that is the end of my rant.
Nice.
Let's move on to the next news topic. Okay, so we're not going to talk too much about the FTC leak and the various PDFs, but one thing that did actually sort of spring to mind was comments from Activision that they were briefed on Switch 2 last year, and Bobby Kotick is saying that basically we're looking at last-gen level performance, PS4 style, which I think would be not bad for a mobile device. But the point is, I think that is only a fraction of what these new machines, what these new handhelds actually offer. Wouldn't you agree, Oliver?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting quote that nonetheless doesn't totally align with what we think we know about the Switch 2. Because, just as one example, could a PS4 play a game like Breath of the Wild at an effective 4K 60 resolution, right? Which is the rumor about the Switch 2. The Switch isn't rendering a 4K pixel grid on every frame, presumably. It's using DLSS. But I don't think in terms of a visual output that the PS4 could match that on the same level, even if the PS4 was capable of 4K visual output. Likewise for Matrix Awakens, maybe there's a version of that could run on last-gen hardware, but certainly in anything like its current state, that demo is not running on a PlayStation 4. So in terms of the raw hardware horsepower, I would suspect the Switch 2 could be falling in line with the capabilities of a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One, but I don't really think in terms of the actual rendering power the Switch 2 might bring to the table in terms of offering DLSS, bringing that to the table. I think the Switch 2 should be able to outperform those consoles, at least in scenarios where the technology is being effectively used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could argue that the Steam Deck is broadly comparable to a last-gen console, and yet we've got Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart running really well on it, which definitely wouldn't happen on a last-gen console. And fundamentally, it's not just about sort of GPU horsepower. There's a lot more that goes into the makeup of a console. Obviously, the CPU is important, but obviously the storage is important as well, right? And, solid state storage is a game changer for the current generation. And it is, opening the door to more experiences on the Steam Deck, and so it will on the Switch 2. The other thing which we can be pretty certain about is that the Switch 2 has the same hardware decompression technology, or similar hardware decompression technology to the current generation of consoles, which is going to have a radical impact on loading times.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on this, Alex? I mean, fundamentally, I think it sort of ignores some of the lessons learned even from the original Switch, which is that it doesn't really matter what the level of horsepower is. Features play a big part too. I mean, that Maxwell class GPU basically was a modern GPU and therefore opened the door to ports of games that had no business running on it.
Yeah, right. And as we saw, I mean, there's a lot of things like that. If it is Ampere, it's got like hardware VRS, it's got DLSS, it's got ray tracing. It's got all the advances that have happened to the DirectX 12 model since then baked into the hardware. Things that Xbox One and PS4 definitely don't have at all. Has access to a lot more RAM, usable RAM, most likely. I think that's the one part of the leak that there isn't a good idea of yet necessarily how much system.
Well, the rumor is there's going to be 12 gigs of memory. I've also heard 8. This isn't really confirmed at the moment.
Yeah, so like there's all those things, there's so much that is making that Switch so much better. And I think also it's not just a low-end Maxwell thing, like you said with the original Switch, where there we saw presentations and examples from developers like Rebellion, who would go the extra mile and do really low-level work that you're just not going to get out of a PC or an Android part at that point. So,
Okay, I think we just have to wait and see what they're going to come up with. But I'm hoping for surprises. I am indeed. In fact, here it is. This Dell laptop here has RTX 2050, which is the weakest Ampere GPU money can buy. And I'm having fun experimenting with it. I've managed to get it down into sort of what you'd expect the GPU clocks for a Switch to be like. And I'm going to be starting on that content pretty much when this Direct finishes. So, we're going to have some interesting fun and games with that. Let's move on to the next news topic. Final news topic of the week, and it's actually a really sort of bizarre, interesting story that started off looking pretty bleak, but had a happy ending, so to speak. Oliver, care to take this one up?
Yeah, so basically, the Matrix Awakens demo, obviously extremely, extremely impressive. And the other day I was basically thinking, I think it was on Saturday night, I should check out the game on Series S, because obviously we have those Nintendo leaks that we were just discussing, with the game potentially running on a Nintendo Switch 2 or hypothetical Switch successor. So I booted the game up, and right away the game was stuck on this connecting screen loop that would repeat every minute or so after the various license holder videos. I checked it out in offline mode with the console totally disconnected from the internet. Didn't fix anything, obviously. Tried the same on Series X, tried the same on PS5. I left the game for about an hour or so on all those consoles. It wasn't being fixed. So I went on Twitter and I searched around, and I saw that some other people were having issues too. So then I posted about it. And I thought at the time the game might be gone for good, because as you remember, the game was delisted, I think about 9 months after release, and presumably the game has a lot of license holders attached to it, which might make that situation a little bit more difficult. And, the fact that they need an online authentication to begin with sort of suggests that maybe the rights might be, not in indefinite term. But ultimately it has been resolved, so I'm very, very thankful for that. And I think it's a very good thing, because I think the demo as it currently exists represents a high watermark for console real-time graphics rendering. Even, now coming up on 2 years after its release, I don't think we've seen any full-featured games that have really come to this level of graphical quality. So I'm very happy that's happened.
Yeah, I mean, you flagged it to me, and I checked it out on my PlayStation 5, and lo and behold, it didn't work. And well, this demo is still incredible to this day, right? And this was Epic basically making a statement about what Unreal Engine 5 is going to do for this generation of consoles. So the concept that you couldn't go back and revisit that, I thought it was really, really bad. So I did actually contact Epic and say, look, this is just not working anymore. What's going on? And it took a couple of days, but it just turned out that the servers weren't active or not functioning properly. And I'm assuming there was some sort of, they turned them off and on again. And everything is back to normal and everything works. And I think that's fine. I think it's excellent news that you can actually now access the Matrix Awakens again, because it is, it's going to be an important reference point for the whole generation. That content should be accessible. And okay, fine if the license rights have expired and you can't download it anymore. But for those that already have it, they should be able to enjoy it. The concept that this demo has some kind of online check-in, though, is absolutely bizarre, because there's no online component to it. So quite why this is happening, I don't understand. I can only assume, possibly you're right, Oliver, that there needs to be some kind of kill switch or something involved, or maybe they're just tracking telemetry or something like that. But I really hope that they they go back and just remove whatever this check is, assuming it doesn't have any importance to the content, simply because this demo needs to be preserved, right? Now, you can obviously access the city sample element of it on PC. That's always going to be there. But that isn't the whole demo. The whole Matrix part of it is completely removed on PC, which is a real shame, because the press photos of that original demo were taken on, I'm assuming, PC, because they're of a much higher resolution and clarity and fidelity than the console versions. So there's no preservation angle for this demo beyond its existence on the consoles. And this whole situation proves to me how delicate and fragile having a piece of content tied to an online authentication system actually is, because it could go wrong at any time. I mean, John often talks about, Microsoft might turn off their Xbox Live servers in the future and we'll lose all of this content. But this is actually something quite different. It was just, as I understand it, a genuine mistake. Right? Just a bit of a bug that cropped up. And, what happens in the future when, that server, it already doesn't seem to have a lot of priority with Epic. So, what happens in the future when, it might just disappear? That means we lose access to this incredible piece of content that sets the stage for the entire generation, in a sense. I just don't think that's great. Anything to add to that?
No, you surmised any points I would say really well, Rich.
Okay, thanks. Well, that's it. That's it. Thanks for validating my viewpoint. Okay, so let's move on to supporter Q&A. This is the part of the show where every week I put out a call for questions for inclusion in any given episode of DF Direct Weekly. Typically get 50 to 70. Too many to answer. We can only choose the ones that think that, possibly we've got something of interest to add. Let's start off with this one from Alan. Hi, DF team. What do you think Sony and Nintendo's reaction to the proposed Gen 10 Xbox will be? PlayStation 6 ARM CPU, etc. Things will change in the coming years tech-wise, but the starting pistol has been fired! ! So what are we looking at for Gen 10 minimum specs? This is an interesting one, right, Oliver, because there was actually quite a specific list of specs for the 10th gen Xbox being mooted there. And obviously the whole strategy, the whole sort of hybrid cloud thing was in there as well. Put yourself in the position of Sony and Nintendo. What do you think they're going to make of that?
On the Nintendo side, certainly their console development wouldn't be affected by this, because as far as we're aware, their console development is obviously in its extremely late stages for their upcoming Switch successor console. And then on the Sony side, I don't know, maybe they could change things in response to this. It certainly seems on the surface like they are faced with the same constraints as Microsoft, or similar constraints, maybe even to a greater degree, because I think they would want to lock in hardware backwards compatibility. I think that's something that's quite important for them. So they're still looking down the path of okay, maybe we do a more modern Zen processor. Maybe it's Zen 6 in terms of the console lifecycle period. And then on the GPU side, they're looking at a more modern AMD GPU. And they probably want to throw in some kind of neural processor in there if they don't think that AMD's ML performance is up to task. So I think their spec, at least at this point, probably does look fairly similar to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you reckon there, Alex?
Yeah, I think since they have that same grab bag of AMD technology to grab from, and I guess from everywhere else too, they're all going to be going and shopping at, when it comes to RAM and when it comes to any other sort of aspect of this. So I would hope they're looking to differentiate themselves again in some capacity. I don't know what kind of tech that would be. I can't really say off the top of my head, but anything that gets around and helps make games easier to make and come out in a better, just looking better at the same time, that'd be really awesome. So Sony, if you look at that presentation around the stuff that isn't maybe so hardware focused, but you look at the vision of cloud integration in the console there with AI that Microsoft had, and you maybe have your own spin or different ideas there, maybe that's the differentiation that they'll see as a result of this presentation that leaked.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Oliver, that Nintendo probably maybe simply raise an eyebrow and move on because it doesn't really relate to their own plans. In terms of Sony's reaction to it, I don't think there's any surprises here for them, right? Because they're going to be talking to exactly the same partner for their upcoming design, possibly, and they'll have access to the same roadmaps. They'll have an idea of their silicon budget, which will be broadly the same as Microsoft's, and then they'll just continue to do what they want to do, right? And I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on their thinking there, and there's probably nothing there that genuinely surprises them because, you know, they've got access to the same timelines, the same technologies, and, you know, they'll just move on. And if you actually look at what Sony did with PlayStation 5, they made a lot of really good decisions on how to use that AMD technology, arguably more efficiently than Xbox, right? Because, you know, we've got as I said in the DF Direct the other day, a smaller slice of silicon is producing comparable performance, if not higher performance, in actual shipping games, which is quite a feat, I think. So, you know, the other thing I think to bear in mind is that, you know, when I've spoken to Mark Cerny, he's got his own vision for what he wants to achieve with a console, working in conjunction with his team. Every time I've spoken to him, he doesn't really seem particularly interested in what anyone else is doing, right? You know, that's the nature of the guy. He's focused, razor focused on what he wants to achieve with the tools that are available to him, and where those technologies don't exist, he helps to create them in working in conjunction with AMD. So yeah, I don't think there's actually going to be that much of a reaction. And to be honest, looking at that sheet when it actually came up, I wasn't particularly surprised by anything that was there. It just sort of seems almost like a continuity console. There's some interesting stuff with machine learning, of course, with the NPU, but with the state of things on PC, they've got to be doing that. It had to be in there. Right. Okay, so the next question, this one's from Andre Serles. Gentlemen, there's been talk of hybrid consoles in the next generation. In your opinion, what features could be offloaded to cloud and what would stay on the local machine? Thoughts on this one, Alex? I mean, we did an article in Eurogamer, and I'm looking at it right now. Dates back to 2013, and it's when Microsoft first came up with the power of the cloud concept. The idea that you could have cloud servers and the local hardware running in concert to produce, game-changing experiences. Those game-changing experiences never happened, simply because, if you've got a completely separate PC or compute unit located hundreds of miles away, you've got latency and bandwidth implications straight off the bat. Yeah. And, there's certain things, sort of deferred tasks that you could have the cloud do, possibly like lighting, some degree of lighting, possibly physics, possibly. I just don't really see this as being a foundational concept for a next generation console, though. I don't know what you think.
I'm just going to take from the things that I've seen exist and say maybe they're possible. So I'll say Flight Simulator 2020 maybe has some we can inference a bit there and say what that's doing, where there's far too much data there. They have an entire representation of the world with all these unique textures and unique buildings and things like that, which they procedurally scatter on top of, but a lot of that is too large, far too large. So they're streaming it in on demand if you have that option set up to get higher fidelity over your internet connection when you load up a new area of the world. Or I guess it can do it creeping, like if you go along the world at the flight path of however kilometers an hour that is. So there's that idea. Like it could enable higher fidelity for ridiculously large worlds if you're streaming in things, as in more visual variation, because there's, just if these new Call of Duty games are already bajillion gigabytes and they're just like these two maps or whatever, just think about think about that, and you can maybe enable that. And I think the other thing is you're doing a MMO or a large open world game. And even though for this large open world game thing, I think it was you who said it last time. Like, do they actually is it really worth it to spin up all this processing time on the side just for one random user? is it really worth the amount of money you put in there?
Well, it's more to the point. What happens if you've got 200,000 users all demanding that resource simultaneously?
I don't know about that. Like, that's where it starts getting a little bit pie on the sky for me still. But you could have in like an MMO, I could see it in like a Star Citizen setting where they do this. Well, that's the idea, is that like when you leave an area, the cloud runs simulation on it to when you return back to it. So that's different. And it's just not just like, it's not like Starfield where you like go to an area and you would see it would be returned in its pristine state that you last loaded into it, etc. So it's like, it's not doing like a seed, but it's actually simulating on that seed. And that's an idea that makes sense for MMOs, but I don't know if it makes sense for single player gaming at all. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oliver?
Yeah, I think there are a few concepts here that would be really interesting. You could have like large language model powered AI systems in terms of what you do in the cloud, large language model powered AI systems for dialogue generation, story generation, maybe even just like flavor text, but also you could set up systems where you basically tell the AI, you prompt it with prompts that basically are like, okay, so, respond to the player in idle conversation. Then after a few responses, you get to the meat of the conversation, which is this topic, and engage with the player in a friendly way. Like there are all kinds of ways that you can script this that are interesting. Other game content, potentially, other content, graphics, art, things like this without creating load or memory issues on the console itself, right? Which could be quite severe. In terms of how you'd scale this, I think one answer to that would basically be that Microsoft has access to an enormous amount of server hardware, and they would simply scale up and scale down load depending on demand. But like they have H100s that can run anything, it doesn't need to be game specific necessarily. So I think it's not an easy problem to solve, but they could use generalized server capacity, which presumably would be quite capacious, right, on their end. They could obviously do physics with some latency to it that might be a little bit of a problem for real-time physics in games, but for like larger scale destruction, I'm sure it would work great. Crackdown obviously demonstrated that. We never actually saw that in his shipping title, which is maybe notable. But I think importantly, from my perspective, I don't think there are a ton of concepts that couldn't be done pretty effectively on existing console hardware. I don't think you need anything too special to do this stuff, except maybe you want more predictive stuff on the client side that would require some specialized hardware in next generation consoles. But I suspect that most of these concepts you could actually iterate on local hardware.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just, the more I think about it, the more I just go back and look at that article and see that just the bandwidth limitation is still there, right? It doesn't really matter if you've got a gigabit internet connection, you've still got latency to the cloud server. It's just, what if you've got, somebody else in your house using the internet heavily at the same time, and it sort of hammers your game performance. Not everyone has gigabit internet. There's so many potential failure points. This is the thing about what's great about the console, right? It's a fixed hardware platform. Its outputs are entirely deterministic because every machine is exactly the same, right? But when you start adding in variables where the developer has no control, all hell can break loose. I still don't think that we're at this position yet where you can rely 100% on an internet connection for a game experience. And I'm just kind of surprised that it would be sort of wheeled out as a brand new concept for a 2028 console when much was made of this back on Xbox One and just nothing ever happened. And I suspect it didn't happen because just because of all of these different potential failure points. I don't know. I'd really like to know what the pitch is. That's the thing about the leaked PDFs, right? You just saw, a presentation. You didn't get any deep dives into how they're actually going to be doing it or what they're actually doing. That's the other thing. You don't really know what they're doing. Really interesting stuff.
Given the timescales here, I think they would need to wheel out a game that's already doing it by around launch time to even make it like a selling point, right? Like here, Xbox Series X launched and had like no exclusive games for an eternity, and they sold it on these certain premises at least. But for that is such a big premise to sell on. They would really need to have games already in development now that are looking to use these things.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that
right?
Exactly
they would start now, like 5-6 years of development time easily. So
Isn't that exactly what Hideo Kojima is doing? He's doing a cloud-based Xbox project.
Wow, that's a good point.
So maybe this is some kind of showcase of what this new console will do. Maybe, you know, how long it takes Kojima to make a game.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Or maybe simply, you know, there's no reason. I don't see any reason why an Xbox Series X couldn't be a similar sort of hybrid cloud compute thing to, you know, just doesn't really sort of all add up to me. But I guess maybe this Kojima game could be quite interesting. It could actually maybe show the way. Let's move on to the next question. This one from The Source. What do you think could be done to educate gamers on the importance of the CPU for game performance? The lack of any good CPU benchmarks for games in comparison to the abundance of GPU benchmarks, especially for games like Starfield and Baldur's Gate 3 Act 3, is really unfortunate. People say I have a 2080 and the game runs bad! ! 1. But then you press them about the CPU and you find out they have an i5 7600K or something more ancient. This has been a problem since, like, you know, forever, really. I do remember when Intel came out with this amazing Pentium chip, a dual-core chip. It only had 2 cores, but it had an unlocked multiplier. I think it was the G3258. Might be wrong there. But, you know, people were connecting it up to like Titans. And, you know, basically the suggestion was, you don't really need a strong CPU. That's definitely not the case now these days, Alex. We're CPU bound in a huge amount of different games, even on good mainstream processors. So what can game developers do to actually point out, hey, you know, this is not a problem with your GPU, it's the CPU?
I think what was happening in Immortals of Avium is an interesting idea of scoring the CPU somehow in the menu, and then letting users understand that, oh, actually, you're going to be sub 60 with your current settings, or just by default, based upon that little score in the menu. And that would be, they could figure out how to do that, but I'm pretty sure they could do it really easily. They could figure that out really easily. They would know, just like from playing the game, they would have an idea of like how a Core i9 whatever plays this one scene at certain amount of FPS. You can just, I've pretty much always seen it now where like the Core i9 1200K is pretty much always just about 2x whatever the Ryzen 5 3600 is. It's like pretty much always 2x. Because most games are single-threaded. It would be a lot more if they were more multi-threaded. So that is an interesting thing. I think developers could do it in the settings menu, for sure. Okay.
Do you think there's maybe maybe something that developers could do? Let's say you're in a period of gameplay where there's a sustained period of poor performance because you're CPU limited. Could there be like some sort of on-screen prompt that says, maybe you should be thinking about... The
Call of Duty games do that, right? Don't the Call of Duty games do that? Where they have like that little barometer icon that can pop up that says like frame swap or frame something. Don't they have that? Am I making this up?
I've not played it on PC.
I haven't played on the PC in a while, but I swear that is a thing they actually have as an option. And so like, you know, if you're having an internet connection issue, or if you know if your GPU's pooping itself. So I think that's what they got, and I think they could do that, and it would be a really good idea for like, say like there'd just be like a CPU fire. This is like, it would show a CPU and it'd say fire. I think that would be really amazing, and it could be on by default, so people would have to turn it off, so they would get an understanding of it before they go to Steam and make a.
I like the idea. I think it needs to be more blatant, though.
Yes.
You know. Upgrade your CPU. You know, I suppose the user could shout back, "Optimize your game." But...
Yeah, they could take the Unreal 2K4 approach and just do a holy shit when you turn up the menu graphic options to Epic or Ultra. That'd be great.
Any thoughts on this one, Oliver? It's a tricky one because typically when poor performance is typically associated with a GPU limitation, and in most scenarios it is, but we're seeing a number of scenarios these days, particularly, you know, on an Unreal game running ray tracing, for example, where the CPU gets absolutely hammered. And it's not immediately visible to the user because, you know, if you turn on ray tracing, you think, okay, well, this is a big tax on my GPU, right? Maybe I need a new GPU.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think that metrics do help a lot in this case, and I'm specifically kind of pondering the idea of trying to re-educate people about the concept of frame health, or maybe more specifically what we used to call microstutters, frame rate latency spikes, because a lot of CPU problems do present that way in games, and I think people don't really understand them when they do occur. Obviously, a lot of those are related to shader compilation, but the ones that aren't are certainly worth addressing, maybe with some metric. I think it would be helpful. So maybe there's some metric that people could implement across games to indicate poor CPU performance, some kind of flag, or to indicate poor frame consistency, so getting a lot of frames that are over a certain latency threshold. But that's a very, very old problem, like dating back to 2011, 2012, dating it back a long time when people first became acutely aware of these issues. So it's really tough for me to imagine something actually occurring.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Aaron Mayo. Lenovo recently told a reviewer that the job of frame rate limiters should not fall on hardware manufacturers, but instead is the responsibility of game developers. Do you agree? Feels like universal solutions like the Steam Decks with proper half, third, quarter VSync with decent frame pacing would widely benefit the industry, from hardware manufacturers through to developers and consumers. Better performing games with smooth frame rates is in the best interests of all parties, surely. I'm sick of having to install Special K to get acceptable performance on PC. I'm sick of blame being passed around.
What do?
Alex, interesting end to that question. What do?
It's like a Lenin quote. Wow. So the funny thing is I just complained about it on both aspects. Like whenever I see a no frame limiter in a game, I always go like, where's the frame limiter? I just said that for Starfield. Because I don't think people can rely inherently on those solutions like Special K. And if you have an AMD card, you can't rely on it, period, because there isn't really that support at the moment. So I want to say it's like both. I want to say like, given the current situation we have in, and it's talked about it before, Steam Deck and also NVIDIA, when you turn on that half, 1/3, 1/4 VSync, you're technically getting a higher level of input latency than you would by doing perhaps a less stable frame rate cap.
Yeah.
And so it's hard. It's a trade-off at that point in time. And I think it's just about enabling more options for the user. So I would really like to actually see both in this case. I would love to see the hardware manufacturer taking it seriously, just like Steam Deck and NVIDIA did. I don't even remember. I think it's almost like more than a decade old that actually NVIDIA added in half refresh rate VSync into the driver. Yeah. And I think that would be great also if especially at this point in time, it's like, so the game developer has the ability to expose it in the menu, but it also needs to be done right on the engine level. So Unreal Engine 5, I still honestly don't know if it's actually done correctly on the engine level there. I don't think it actually is.
I think there are games where it definitely does function correctly.
Okay, I can't off the top of my head, no.
I just get the idea that when you're really taxing a GPU at the frame rate limit, it has trouble with getting good frame consistency with a frame rate limiter. That's what I think. I mean, I've played the last game Unreal Engine that I played that it seemed to work just fine was Remnant 2. It seemed all right there, and that was on a handheld. But yeah, interesting. I kind of see where this is coming from, because Lenovo obviously have their Legion device coming, which is a handheld in the vein of ROG Ally, Steam Deck, etc. Now, Steam Deck, Valve are completely in control of the operating system. They can add this hardware level feature that actually works quite nicely. It gives you more options. It's a bit trickier on the Windows side of things, I'd say. And you do end up having, obviously to look at stuff like Special K in a lot of instances to get properly frame-paced good frame rate limits there. I don't know what to say about this. I wonder whether it's something that the GPU could do better in terms of its control panel options. I mean, we've got the latent sync option on Special K, which seems to be able to deliver a good half-rate VSync with far less of a latency penalty than NVIDIA's solution. Maybe it should be AMD and NVIDIA looking to what Special K is doing and coming up with control panel solutions. Possibly a control panel that's more readily accessible in game. so you can actually experiment with these options. Something has to be done. I'm not sure. Leaving it to game developers is the best solution, though. Do you have any ideas on this one, Oliver?
Not too many. I agree with Alex that it's very important to get it in hardware and very important to get it in the games themselves. But I would maybe say that it's more important to get it in the hardware on some level, just because games are so inconsistent with how they handle frame rate caps. Some of the frame rate caps suck. Like, I just think getting that up to a good level on all games is going to be a little bit more of a difficult task. And I agree that maybe someone should partner with Caldean for a better solution, maybe a simple overlay version, if that could be accommodated, or a version that's compatible with like custom launchers. That would be cool. I think games should offer better FPS caps. I think hardware vendors should offer better FPS caps. I think Lenovo probably should offer a good FPS cap. But being realistic, I think that probably the onus is a little bit more on the hardware vendor, just because it's a comprehensive solution potentially.
Yeah, in terms of the desktop GPU, I mean, I would love to have an integrated version of Special K in the NVIDIA and AMD control panels, a simplified version, because it's actually quite dense, and the full fat experience, dare I say it, because it's just a brilliant tool. It's transformative for PC gaming in many respects. But yeah, what do? I just don't know. But that would be my preferred route forward. Now let's move on to the final question. This one from Dylan. There is an incredible amount of computing happening when I play a game. So why am I still manually tuning graphics settings like a caveman? Couldn't the DLSSs all work together to adjust themselves to hit a target frame rate? The quote-unquote auto setting in DLSS 2 seems to be just another name for performance at 4K output resolution, which is exactly what it is.
It's exactly what it is.
It's performance mode at 4K, balanced at 1440p, and quality at 1080p, and I suspect lower. Alex, what do you think about this? I am reminded, I think I mentioned this in a direct a couple of weeks back, of Forza Horizon 3, which seemed to have auto settings management. That actually works quite well. But yeah, actually, this is an interesting point where, if you've got these phenomenal AI capabilities built into, the latest GPUs, why can't they be thinking out the best settings for us?
I guess they really, really could. I mean, NVIDIA and AMD are now, like, to a certain degree, recommending settings. And we know about it through those NVIDIA profiles you can optionally click on if you install GeForce Experience. And I always unclick that because I think they're not very transparent. Because I don't even think they try and go for like a consistent 60 FPS. I think they go for like an unlocked 60.
Yeah.
I think that was the last time when I tried them, what it was doing. So it wasn't like an experience that I thought was great. And I think really it's a hard problem to solve, though, because each game has different settings. Each game has settings that may or may not actually have anything to do with your GPU or anything to do with your CPU, which is maybe like we talked in 3 questions ago or 2 questions ago about like how that's actually the biggest limiting factor in a lot of things. So this is a hard one. I would love it to be done, though. Like, why couldn't there be an AI program that recognizes your refresh rate target and then works from there to dial things back? I think the DLSS auto mode on DLSS is really dumb, though. I really wish it were different. I really wish DLSS could actually just DRS by default without the developer doing anything, because in that they have the ability to switch between the levels at the whenever they want. Why can't they also just switch between the levels in real time based upon driver metrics of what the current performance is? I mean, and doesn't AMD has the ability with their HyperRX GPU boost to reduce the resolution of a game in a really disgusting way when you move your mouse. But they have the ability to do that. It tells you that they have the ability, based upon some sort of metric, to adjust the resolution in a game. And that's really interesting. And I think that could be applied to other metrics that are more relevant than your mouse movement. Maybe like the actual, like we have the ability to see GPU utilization and we have the ability to see the current frame rate of the current frame. Like surely these things could be done at a driver level in a much more interesting way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also typically it is the case that when I'm looking at your optimized settings, it isn't actually a huge amount of settings that have game-changing performance differentials.
Right.
So it's basically that maybe that could help here in that it would be, basically tweaking the ones that have the most impact to frame time. That would possibly be a way to make the process a bit more easier to manage. I don't know. It's certainly an interesting concept. Oliver?
Yeah, I think that just reading through this question, real-time adjustment of game settings might not be a super great idea for a few reasons. Obviously, I think we saw that in the Forza Horizon games, but we don't often see that even on consoles in terms of like a continuous adjustment of actual visual settings to hit a certain target. Yeah. And I think it's probably less intrusive, especially with upsamplers these days and targeting very high resolutions as we are, to just adjust adjust input resolution, hopefully, and achieve a similar result that way. Automatic tuning of settings, though, would be great, but perhaps as a one-off adjustment and not a continuous adjustment. In terms of the dynamic resolution question, I think that dynamic res should be something that's more common on PC and tracks very closely with GPU load in a way that's appropriate to maintaining a stable frame rate. And it would be great to see that in a way that's game agnostic. But one potential issue there is that PC players don't really seem to want dynamic res as much, and it seems like there's a bit more of an emphasis on having absolute control over game settings, whereas I tend to favor the more console-like approach of saying, well, make it look good, hit these frame rate metrics, and then the internal resolution of the game is less important to me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just thinking, actually, Elden Ring seems to have some kind of dynamic settings adjustment based on Tom's content. It just doesn't seem to work particularly well. So, yeah, I mean, that's the other thing is, this real-time settings adjustment, what would happen with latency? It would have to basically be predicting that you're going to be encountering a GPU-heavy scene and adjust stuff accordingly. I think it is definitely going to have to be a game implementation. And yeah, I think basically if you're at a specific and hopefully higher resolution, dynamic resolution scaling just solves a lot of problems a lot more easily. Mm-hmm. But certainly interested to see whether there's anything in this and whether there's anything that that NVIDIA might be able to do with DLSS. Ultimately, though, I think the concept of what Alex is doing with optimized settings is that you're getting that performance back all the time. Which should give you more consistent performance overall. So, yeah. I mean, definitely it seems to be the case that I think there should be a way for users to have easier accessibility to consistent frame rates and frame times. I think that's a given. But that's it. That's the last question. Therefore, the end of the show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring the bell for notifications. DF Supporter Program. Get involved. DF Direct Weekly privileges there, early access, ability to ask questions, bonus materials, early access on other content. There's a lot going on there. And get a weekly update as well from me every single week, which tells you exactly what we're up to at any given point. And you can also suggest things that you'd like for us to take a look at. It's pretty awesome. But that's all from us for this week. Thanks for watching.